Hi. So today I'm going to talk about the differences between the US banks and the European banks. I've worked with both. So I thought of sharing my own experience. I worked with more number of European banks compared to that of the US banks. So my views might be slightly biased, but I'll try not to be biased. The first difference obviously is that the regulator in the US is Federal Reserve, whereas it is ECB in European Union, Bank of England in UK. And when UK was still part of European Union, ECB was the sole regulator for the entire region. Of course, there are local regulators as well, but the central regulator was just the ECB. Now there are differences between the Federal Reserve and the ECB in many ways. Fed is more strict in many areas, whereas ECB is not that strict. And when you are working under strict regulations, things can be very different. ECB, working style is more, bureaucratic, right, and can be also very slow. So while on one hand it can give you some leeway, some more time to do things, it can also be a bit frustrating sometimes to get responses from the regulators. It can also be a bit frustrating for the banks actually to get things done, to get things to get approval. Most banks don't complain about it because most banks are behind the schedule set by regulators in Europe, so they don't complain about it. But that's not the case in the US. Fed is always after these banks to be on time, and I think Fed has a better working style and working relationship with the US banks compared to what ECB has got. And it's also because of the nature of the jurisdiction. ECB is in European Union. It's a combination of more than 20 countries, I think 27 countries if I'm not wrong. So when you combine, when you bring together so many countries and so many local regulators and come up with a single regulation that is applicable to all the banks in these 27 countries, it becomes very difficult. It becomes more diplomatic then, right? So there will be bureaucratic hurdles, and that's what really plagues ECB. So that's one big difference. How does it affect the employees who work there? Well, it affects in many other ways actually, and I'm going to talk about that also, right? But one big difference is the work-life balance and the pay structure, the types of business this do. I'll talk about those things also. Second bigger difference is that the US banks are more international, a lot more international actually. Most big banks, US banks, Citibank, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, these banks are heavily international in every possible way, right? They are present in almost all countries, all continents in the world. Their business is not just limited to the US consumers, but outside of the US, they have very good presence. In terms of the people who work there, it's also very international. You will be surprised to know how many of the senior executives are not from the US, despite they being the US banks. That's much less actually in Europe. Most of the European banks are headed by Europeans. In fact, in most scenarios, someone from that given country where the bank is located, right? So you will not find many international people working in European banks, at least at an executive level. At a lower level, yes, you will have many internationals, people outside of the country working with these companies, but at an executive level, less. In terms of business, these European banks also were quite international at some point. Before 2008 financial crisis, many European banks, such as ABN AMRO, and many other banks, used to be very, very international. But things changed after 2008 crisis. A lot of these European banks suffered a lot, and countries where governments were reluctant to bail out some of these banks, and it was really tough for the government. For instance, the Dutch government faced a lot of issues when it went out to help ABN AMRO, right? And many other banks, European banks, also suffered because of that. And hence the regulations were more tight about how much business you can do outside of your country. And also I think many banks realize that it's better for them, for their own survival, to focus on their own market, the local market, and not to have big ambitions of venturing out into other countries, in Asia or in Africa or in other places, or emerging market economies where doing business is not that easy in those places. European banks are staying away from that, whereas US banks are still quite ambitious. So yes, that's one big difference. As an employee, when we work there, it does make a difference because when the focus is entirely, mostly, on the local economy and not international, right? You tend to have this view that as an international employee, someone who is not from this country, you may not have, I mean, you may get stuck at some point. You may not have opportunities beyond a point. That's not always true, actually. Many banks still have, many European banks still have substantial, sizable international business. And certainly not true in UK, at least, or Netherlands and in Germany, but it can be very true in banks like in Spain and Italy, and also some of the other smaller, less wealthy European countries, right? So that's, and language difference is one also. In US banks, you have English being used as the primary language, in fact the only language, whereas in European banks English is still quite used, but you also have the local language. So if you're coming from abroad, you don't know the local language, then you will have the issue. Right? I mean, in most European banks, you can live with English. Just you don't have to learn the local language, but it is better if you learn the local language, right? For some jobs, especially for the front office jobs, you will be required to know the local language as well. So that's another difference. If you work with the US bank, that's not an issue, because as long as you know English, I think you're good. Okay. Um, the US banks have more diversified business. They are into all kinds of lending, trading, all kinds of banking. They are into investment banking big time. They are into trading as well. Even after the 2008, not to the extent they used to do before 2008, but they're still quite big time into those businesses, more risky, interesting businesses. Whereas European banks have cut down on their trading activities, their wealth management, investment banking activities. Very famously, the Credit Suisse, which went bankrupt last year, well, this year, and it was taken over by UBS. Was focusing a lot on investment banking and in wealth management activities, and it suffered a lot. So the core banking was not given due importance, and a lot of the European banks have realized that they need to do the core activity of which is doing lending, and not do less core activities like wealth management, trading, and investment banking, which haven't been very beneficial for many of these banks. Whereas US banks, big ones, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, they're still quite big into all these non-core banking businesses, and they're heavily invested in all these businesses in all parts of the world, including the emerging markets. um, yeah, if you work as an employee in a US bank, you're likely to make more money. You get paid more, but the jobs are less stable. The number of people get fired from US banks every year is a lot more compared to that in the European Union, including the UK. Jobs are more stable if you work for European banks compared to that of the US banks. um, okay, there's more job security. Okay, pays are less, but you get pension and benefits, extra benefits, which you probably don't get much in if you work for US banks. Of course, you get more bonuses and all that, which is also quite lucrative. But if you compare with the executive pay, right, it's a lot different. At a lower level, middle level, management level, the differences are less, maybe 20%, 30% for 30% maybe. But if you compare the executive level pay, right, and the CEO of an European bank could be making like less than 10% of what the CEO of a big US bank makes, right? CEOs of JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Citi, they make over 10 million US dollar a year, whereas most CEOs of European banks, they make anywhere between 1 million to 2 million. In fact, some of them don't even make 1 million. So that's very very different from what you see in the US. And that's not just for the CEO, but also for other executives. The senior executives in European banks, they don't make a lot of money. I mean, they still make quite decent money, but compared to that of the senior executives in the US banks, the pays are much, 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 much less. That's also the reason why you have surplus money to handle any crisis situations. They always have money actually set aside. And that's also the reason why last year when there was a crisis, while the US banks were firing people, the European banks were giving extra money, or raising the salaries to compensate for the inflation, right? So that's very rare to see in US banks doing that, right? And that's because executives don't make hundreds of millions in European banks. So the profit is equally shared among all the employees, not just the top executives. Okay. In terms of work-life balance, it is much better in European banks compared to that in the US banks. Work-life balance is much better. In perhaps the biggest difference I've seen between the US banks and the European banks, I have colleagues working for Citibank and those JP Morgan who have complained to me. When I talk to them, they complain about work-life balance being not good, and they don't want to continue working for these banks for a long time. But it's easier said than done, right? Once you have a high-paying job, you get used to the good salary, and then it's not easy to quit your job or to change your career. But that's not the case in European banks. You can have an amazing work-life balance. So if you are a mother, if you are plan to raise a kid along with your job, I think it's much better to work for European banks compared to the US banks. Also, the work culture is better, right? I know for a fact that the work culture in US banks is also not necessarily very great. Whereas in European banks, you always get respect, and there are always the decisions are made through consensus, and discussions can happen. You can be very open about things. The things that you don't even like, things which are controversial, you still can discuss with your managers and seniors, which is quite rare in US banks. Okay. But US banks also are better in many ways. If you're ambitious, quite ambitious guy, you should work for US banks. Salaries are great. The executive salaries are amazing. US banks are always on top of the trend. They're always using the latest of the technologies available. They're always after the opportunities anywhere in the world. So they're always looking out for. They're very ambitious, right? They're risk takers. So if you are an ambitious guy, you should work for US bank. If you start your career, I think it's always good to start with the US banks. You make more money. You learn a lot of things because US banks spend a lot of money in upgrading the latest technology. They're heavily investing nowadays in AI. So the AI adoption in US banks is much, much, much better compared to the European banks. So, better to start your career there. You learn a lot, but, after working there for 10, 15 years, when you want a bit of work-life balance, you probably can switch to European banks, and you can have a much better work-life balance and a more stable career, right? So these are some of the differences I have experienced, but there may be other differences also, right? If you have any such experience, please let me know in the comment section. If you have any questions, as always, do not hesitate to ask me in the comment section. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and see you in another video, guys. Thanks.